On a cold winter night, a millionaire dines alone in a luxury restaurant when a 6-year-old beggar girl timidly enters the establishment, holding her stomach from hunger. She approaches a waiter and whispers, "Sir, can you give me some food? I'll even accept someone's leftovers." When the security guard grabs her arm and she starts crying, the millionaire stands up and shouts, "Take your hands off her, she's my daughter," and invites the girl to dine with him. The next day, the girl appears at his office bringing a gift, the only valuable thing she owned. When he sees what it was, he starts crying. The biting December wind whipped against the windows of Le Bernardin restaurant as Edward Davis watched the raindrops slide down the glass like silent tears. At 42, he possessed everything money could buy, a fortune built with sweat and intelligence, a penthouse in a prime Manhattan district, luxury cars he rarely drove. Yet, on that cold night, sitting alone at a table reserved for two, he felt an emptiness that all his millions couldn't fill. Isabella had been in Paris for 3 weeks, enjoying a shopping spree that seemed to stretch indefinitely. Her messages arrived sporadically, always accompanied by photos in expensive boutiques or exclusive restaurants, as if to constantly remind him that her absence was intentional. Edward sighed, swirling the red wine in his crystal glass, watching as the dark liquid reflected the golden lights of the sophisticated ambiance. The restaurant buzzed with the muffled conversations of high society. Elegant women displayed jewels worth more than a house, while men in suits discussed multi-million-dollar deals between bites. Edward knew that world of appearances, but that night he felt like a stranger observing a play he no longer wanted to be a part of. It was then that she appeared. A small figure emerged at the restaurant's entrance, so fragile she seemed like a ghost materialized by the night's mist. The girl couldn't have been more than 6 years old, wearing a torn coat that had once been pink but was now a mix of undefined colors. Her brown hair was disheveled, and her large, dark eyes shone with a mix of fear and desperate hope. Edward felt his heart quicken as he watched the child timidly approach the nearest waiter. Her small hands clutched her stomach, and even at a distance, he could hear the soft, broken sound of her voice. "Sir, please." "Could I have some food? I'll take anything, even leftovers." The silence that followed was deafening. All conversations ceased instantly, as if someone had paused the world. Patrons turned in their chairs, some with expressions of shock, others of thinly disguised disgust. The girl remained there, vulnerable and exposed, awaiting a reply that didn't come. The waiter, visibly embarrassed, looked around for help. It was then that the restaurant's security guard, a burly man in a black suit, advanced with heavy steps toward the child. His thick fingers closed around the girl's thin arm, squeezing with unnecessary force. "Get out of here! This isn't a place for beggars!" he shouted, pulling her toward the door. The girl began to cry, a sharp, desperate sound that cut through the air like a blade. Her tears fell freely as she tried to break free from the painful grip, but her strength was insufficient against the man's brutality. Edward felt something explode within his chest. A primitive rage, mixed with a compassion he didn't know he possessed, seized every fiber of his being. Without thinking of the consequences, without calculating the risks to his reputation, he stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair in the process. "Get your hands off her!" His voice echoed through the restaurant like thunder. "She's my daughter." Time stopped. 200 pairs of eyes turned to Edward, who remained standing, breathing heavily, his face red with indignation. The security guard immediately released the girl, as if he had been electrocuted. The child looked at Edward with an expression of complete confusion, her tears still glistening on her dirty cheeks. Edward had no idea what he had just done. He didn't know why he had lied that way, nor what the consequences of that impulsive moment would be. All he knew was that he couldn't allow them to hurt that helpless child. But now, with all eyes on him and a lie hanging in the air, Edward would have to figure out how to turn his words into reality, even if it cost him everything he possessed. The silence in the restaurant was so thick that Edward could hear his own heart beating erratically. The lie he had just uttered hung in the air like a storm cloud, and he knew there was no turning back. All eyes remained fixed on him, awaiting an explanation he didn't have. The girl remained standing where the security guard had released her, looking at Edward with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Her tears had ceased, but the wet streaks still glistened on her dirty cheeks. She didn't understand what was happening, but she sensed that something had drastically changed in her favor. Edward took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor in his hands. He had never been a father. He had never wanted children. Isabella had always made it clear that children were not part of her luxurious life plans. But there, in that moment, looking at that fragile, frightened child, something inside him changed permanently. "Come here, sweetie," he said, his voice softer, extending his hand toward the girl. "You must be very hungry." The child hesitated for a moment, like a wounded animal, not entirely trusting someone offering help. Her large eyes scanned Edward's face, searching for signs of deceit or cruelty. She must have seen something that reassured her, because she slowly began to walk toward him. The restaurant manager, an elegant middle-aged man, approached the table with cautious steps. Edward had known him for years. He had always been treated with the deference reserved for the most important clients. But now there was something different in his eyes, a mixture of concern and thinly disguised curiosity. "Mr. Davis," the manager whispered, "perhaps it would be better if you discussed this in a more private setting." Edward understood immediately. His reputation was being jeopardized with every second he remained there. The other patrons were already whispering among themselves, and he could imagine how the story would spread through social circles even before the night ended. But he looked again at the girl, who was now beside him, trembling with cold and hunger, and knew there was no choice. "No," he replied firmly. "My daughter will dine here with me at the table I reserved." The word "daughter" sounded strange coming from his mouth, but it also brought an unexpected sense of protection and responsibility. Edward pulled out a chair for the girl, helping her to sit. She was so small that she could barely reach the table properly. "What's your name?" Edward asked, sitting down again and trying to sound natural amidst the curious stares. "Sophia," she replied quietly, still distrustful. "But why did you say I'm your daughter? I don't have a father." The innocent question hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He realized he had gotten himself into a much more complex situation than he had imagined. How to explain to a 6-year-old that he had lied to protect her. How to justify a charade he didn't even fully understand. "Are you hungry?" He diverted the subject, picking up the menu. "You can order anything you want." Sophia looked at the menu with wide eyes. The letters were incomprehensible to her, and the prices were meaningless numbers. Her experience with food was limited to scraps found in the trash or leftovers that some kind merchant occasionally offered her. "I can't read," she admitted shyly, lowering her head. "And I've never eaten in a place like this." Edward felt a pang of pain in his chest. How many children like Sophia wandered the streets, invisible to people like him? How many nights had he dined alone in expensive places while small human beings went hungry outside? "Oh, then I'll order for you," he said gently. "How about we start with a nice warm soup?" When the waiter approached, Edward noticed the young man's embarrassed expression. The entire restaurant staff was obviously uncomfortable with the situation, but they dared not question such an important client. "Bring a vegetable soup for the young lady," Edward ordered, and then a plate of pasta with a mild sauce and a hot chocolate. As they waited for the food, Edward observed Sophia discreetly. Despite the dirt and worn clothes, there was something special about her, a natural dignity that poverty couldn't destroy, a silent strength that kept her alive despite all adversity. It was then that Edward understood something that would change his life forever. This wasn't just a lie spoken in the heat of the moment. It was a calling, a destiny he had chosen to accept without even realizing it. But how to turn a charade into reality without destroying everything he had built? The soup arrived steaming, served in a white porcelain bowl with golden details. Sophia looked at the dish as if it were a priceless treasure, her small hands trembling slightly as she held the silver spoon. Edward watched her every movement, noticing how careful, almost reverent, she was with each utensil. "You can eat," Edward encouraged softly. "It's yours." Sophia took the first spoonful to her mouth and closed her eyes. The taste of the homemade soup, prepared with fresh ingredients and selected seasonings, exploded on her palate like a symphony of completely new sensations. She had never experienced anything so delicious, so nourishing, so dignified. Tears began to stream silently down her face. Edward felt his heart contract. "What's wrong, Sophia?" "Is the soup not good?" "It's very good," she sobbed softly without stopping eating. It's just that I haven't eaten in 3 days, and I've never eaten anything so delicious in my whole life." 3 days. The information hit Edward like lightning. A 6-year-old child had gone 3 whole days without food, while he worried about expensive wines and sophisticated dishes. How many other children were in that same situation at that very moment? 3 days, he repeated, trying to keep his voice controlled. "Where have you been sleeping, Sophia?" "In different places," she replied between spoonfuls, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Sometimes under the bridge, sometimes at the church door when it's too cold. Yesterday I slept on a park bench, but the rain woke me up." Edward clenched his fists under the table. The anger he felt wasn't directed at the girl, but at a world that allowed children to live in such conditions. How had he gotten to the point of becoming so oblivious to the suffering that existed right before his eyes? The main course arrived, delicate pasta with a mild tomato sauce, specially prepared for a child's palate. Sophia looked at the generous portion with genuine astonishment. It was more food than she had seen together in a long time. "Can I eat all of this?" she asked incredulously. "Of course," Edward replied, watching her savor each bite with a gratitude that deeply moved him. "And if you're still hungry, we can order more." As Sophia ate, Edward noticed the other patrons in the restaurant. Some had resumed their conversations, but many still cast curious and judging glances toward their table. He could hear muffled whispers, comments about his daughter, and speculations about where she had been all this time. "Mr. Davis," the manager approached again, this time with a more worried expression. "I apologize for interrupting, but some clients are asking about the situation. Perhaps it would be better if..." "Perhaps better what?" Edward interrupted him, his voice carrying an authority that made the man recoil. "My daughter is having dinner with me. Do you see a problem with that?" The manager shook his head quickly and walked away. But Edward knew the situation was far from simple. His reputation, carefully built over decades, was being questioned based on a lie he didn't know how to sustain. Sophia finished her main course and looked timidly at Edward. "Thank you very much, sir. That was the best food of my life." "Don't call me sir," Edward said gently. "Call me Dad." The word sounded strange, but at the same time it brought a sense of completeness he had never experienced. Sophia looked at him with surprise, then smiled for the first time since she had entered the restaurant. It was a sweet, innocent smile that lit up her dirty, tired face. "Dad," she repeated, testing the word, "are you going to take me home with you?" The simple, direct question left Edward speechless. Home? His luxurious penthouse, decorated by famous designers, with immaculate white furniture and artwork worth fortunes. How to explain to Sophia that that world had no place for a street girl? But looking into her hopeful eyes, Edward understood that he had reached a point of no return. He couldn't just give Sophia a meal and then abandon her on the streets again. The lie he had told had become a real responsibility, a promise he didn't know how to keep. "Yes," he finally replied, surprising himself. "I'm taking you home." But even as he uttered those words, Edward knew he was getting involved in a situation that could completely destroy his carefully planned life. The drive home in Edward's car was shrouded in tense silence. Sophia was huddled in the Mercedes leather seat, her big eyes absorbing every detail of the luxurious interior. Her small hands delicately touched the soft fabric as if she feared soiling or breaking it just by touching. Edward drove automatically, his mind working frantically to process what he had done. In a matter of 2 hours, he had publicly lied, taken responsibility for an unknown child, and promised things he didn't know how to fulfill. The weight of these impulsive decisions began to settle on his shoulders like a heavy burden. "Dad!" Sophia's soft voice broke the silence, making him flinch. The word still sounded surreal coming from her lips. "Is your home very far?" "No, sweetie. We're almost there," he replied, watching her in the rearview mirror. Sophia had partially fallen asleep, her exhausted little body finally relaxing after days of tension and hunger. When they arrived at the city's most exclusive residential building, Edward felt a growing anxiety. The doorman, always cordial and discreet, looked with obvious surprise at Sophia. Edward could see the questions forming in the man's eyes, but his professional training prevented him from verbalizing them. "Good evening, Mr. Davis," the doorman greeted, trying to maintain naturalness. "How is Mrs. Montgomery?" "She's still traveling," Edward replied dryly, picking Sophia up. The girl weighed so little that she seemed like a rag doll in his arms. "This is my daughter, Sophia." The doorman's eyes widened, clearly confused. In 5 years working in that building, he had never heard Edward mention having a daughter, but he nodded respectfully, opening the elevator door without comment. During the ascent to the 30th floor, Edward watched Sophia slowly wake up. Her eyes widened when the elevator doors opened, revealing the private hall of his apartment. Italian marble, crystal chandeliers, and paintings by renowned artists created an atmosphere of opulence that the girl had never imagined existed. "You live here," she whispered, impressed. "We live here," Edward corrected, surprised by his own answer. With each word he uttered, the lie became more real, more complicated to sustain. When he opened the apartment door, Sophia was literally speechless. The spacious area, with double-height ceilings and a panoramic view of the city, was like a palace compared to anywhere she had ever been. The immaculate white furniture, the artwork on the walls, and the polished marble floor created an environment that felt more like a museum than a home. "Can I really come in?" she asked hesitantly. Looking at her dirty feet and torn clothes, Edward felt a pang of pain in his chest. Sophia was so used to rejection that she didn't even believe she could enter a beautiful place. "Of course you can. This is your home now." But even as he spoke, Edward knew that statement was far from true. How would a street child adapt to that sterile environment? How would he explain her presence to Isabella when she returned? How would he sustain that charade in the face of the social pressure that would surely come? Sophia slowly walked through the living room, touching everything with reverence. When she reached the bookshelf, she stopped in front of a framed photo. Edward and Isabella at a gala, she stunning in a designer dress, he elegant in a tuxedo. "Who is she?" Sophia asked, pointing to Isabella. Edward hesitated. How to explain Isabella to a child? How to mention that his girlfriend would probably react with horror to Sophia's presence? "She's a friend of mine," he replied evasively. "She's pretty," Sophia commented innocently. "Does she like children?" The simple question revealed the complexity of the situation Edward had gotten himself into. Isabella not only disliked children, but considered them an unnecessary nuisance in her life of luxury and freedom. Her reaction when she discovered Sophia would be explosive. "Let's take care of you first," Edward diverted. "You need to take a bath and put on clean clothes." He led Sophia to one of the guest rooms, an elegant but cold space, decorated in neutral tones. The girl looked at the king-size bed as if it were an unattainable cloud. "Am I sleeping here?" "Yes," Edward replied, realizing how the word yes was becoming increasingly heavy. Each confirmation led him deeper into a situation he didn't know how to escape. While Sophia bathed in the marble bathroom, Edward sat on the edge of the bed, burying his head in his hands. What had he done? In a matter of hours, he had taken responsibility for a child he didn't know, lied to dozens of people, and promised a future he didn't know how to provide. His phone vibrated. A message from Isabella. "Honey, I saw photos of you on some friends' Instagram." Who was that dirty child at the restaurant? "People are saying strange things. Call me when you can." Edward looked at the phone screen and realized his lie had already spread on social media. In a few hours, he would have to face not only Isabella, but the entire society that would judge him for his impulsive decision. Edward woke up on the living room sofa, his neck sore and his mind confused. He had spent the entire night thinking about how to explain the situation to Isabella, rehearsing words that sounded increasingly absurd. The golden morning light filtered through the curtains, creating soft patterns on the marble floor. The apartment was too quiet. For a moment, Edward wondered if it hadn't all been a bizarre dream, a fantasy created by his lonely mind. But then he heard a soft noise coming from the kitchen, and reality returned like a bucket of cold water. Sophia was standing at the granite counter, trying to reach a glass in the high cabinet. She had put on one of his dress shirts, which served as a long dress on her small body. Her hair, clean after the previous night's bath, shone golden under the natural light. "Good morning, Dad," she said with a shy smile. "Sorry I woke you, I was trying to get water, but everything here is too high for me." The word "Dad" still caused a strange impact in Edward's chest. "Good morning, sweetie. Let me get it for you." He easily reached the glass and filled it with cold water from the refrigerator. "Did you sleep well?" "It was the best night of my life," Sophia replied, drinking the water as if it were the most precious liquid in the world. "The bed is so soft I thought I was floating, and the pillow smells so nice." Edward observed the genuine gratitude in her eyes and felt a mixture of happiness and guilt. How could a child be so grateful for basic things like a clean bed and a glass of water? How many nights had she spent thirsty and cold on the streets? "Dad," Sophia continued, her voice becoming more serious, "I have something for you." She ran to the sofa where she had left her old coat the night before. With extreme care, she pulled a small teddy bear from the inner pocket. The toy was clearly worn out. Pieces of its brown fur were missing. One of its eyes was loose, hanging by a thread, and there were patches made with different fabric scraps. "This is Theodore," Sophia introduced, holding the teddy bear as if it were made of gold. "He's been my best friend for a long time. I don't know where he came from. He's always been with me." Edward knelt to be at her height, realizing the solemnity of the moment. Sophia held the teddy bear against her chest, her eyes filling with tears. "And yesterday was the best day of my whole life," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You gave me real food, a warm bath, and a soft bed. Since I don't have money to pay for all of it, I want to give you what's most valuable to me." She extended the teddy bear toward Edward, her small hands trembling. "Theodore always comforted me when I was scared or hungry. He's my only family. But now you're my family too. So I want you to have him." Edward felt tears well up in his eyes. The pure generosity of that child, willing to give up her only possession to reciprocate the kindness received, completely broke down his emotional defenses. Sophia was literally offering everything she owned in the world. "Sophia," he said with a choked voice, "you don't have to give me anything. What I did yesterday was because I wanted to. Not because I expected payment, but I want to give it to you," she insisted, pushing the teddy bear toward his hands. "Theodore will take care of you when I'm not around, and that way a part of me will always be with you." Edward delicately took the teddy bear as if it were a priceless treasure. The toy smelled of dampness and suffering, but it also carried the unconditional love of a child who had found hope amidst despair. "Thank you." "Sophia," he whispered, hugging her along with the teddy bear, "but know that Theodore will stay with us. He can be our family friend." Sophia smiled through her tears, and Edward understood at that moment that his life had irrevocably changed. There was no turning back. That child had become a part of him in a way he couldn't explain or rationalize. It was then that the doorbell rang. Edward looked at the intercom and saw the image of the doorman, his expression worried. "Mr. Davis," the voice through the intercom said, "Mrs. Montgomery is coming up. She said she arrived as a surprise from Paris." Edward felt his blood run cold. Isabella had returned earlier than expected, and he wasn't prepared to face her reaction to Sophia's presence. Edward heard the familiar sound of keys in the lock and felt panic seize his body. Sophia was by his side, still holding his hand. Not understanding the gravity of the situation that was about to unfold, he had only a few seconds to think of how to present the situation, but no explanation seemed adequate. The door opened forcefully, and Isabella entered like an elegant hurricane. Even after hours of travel, she was impeccable in her beige linen set, blonde hair perfectly styled, and makeup untouched. Her designer luggage was left at the entrance as she walked purposefully toward the living room. "Edward, what's this story spreading about you and a street child?" she began before even looking around. "I received at least 20 messages from friends saying you were at Le Bernardin with a dirty girl, saying she was your daughter. Obviously it's a lie, but—" Isabella stopped abruptly when her eyes met Sophia. The child was partially hidden behind Edward, wearing his dress shirt as an improvised dress, holding the worn teddy bear against her chest. The silence that followed was deafening. What is this?" Isabella whispered, her voice filled with disbelief and thinly disguised horror. "Isabella, this is Sophia," Edward said, placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. "Sophia, this is Isabella." "Hi," Sophia said timidly, giving a small curtsy as she had seen in movies. "You're even prettier up close." Isabella looked at the child as if she were an apparition. Her eyes swept over Sophia from head to toe, noticing her bare feet, her still slightly disheveled hair, and the way she clung to the old teddy bear. "Edward," Isabella said, her voice controlled but dangerously low, "I need to talk to you. Now. In private." "Sophia," Edward said gently, "how about you watch TV in your room? Isabella and I need to talk." Sophia nodded obediently, but before leaving, she looked at Isabella one last time. Are you staying for breakfast? Dad said he was going to teach me how to make pancakes." The word "dad" hit Isabella like a slap in the face. Her eyes widened, and Edward saw rage beginning to form on her perfect features. Sophia ran off to the room, leaving the two adults alone in a silence charged with tension. "Dad!" Isabella exploded as soon as Sophia was out of sight. "Dad! Edward! What the hell is going on here?" "Isabella, let me explain." "Explain?" She interrupted him, her voice rising several octaves. "Explain how you magically have a 6-year-old daughter I never knew existed. Explain how this child appeared out of nowhere in our home." "She didn't appear out of nowhere," Edward defended himself. "She was hungry, alone, and I—" "And you what? Decided to play daddy overnight?" Isabella began to pace the living room like a caged animal. "Edward, have you completely lost your mind? This child is a stranger. You know nothing about her, where she came from, what diseases she might have." "She's just a child who needed help," Edward retorted, feeling anger grow in his chest. "A child who was starving while we spent fortunes in expensive restaurants. Oh, for heaven's sake!" Isabella threw her hands in the air. "So now you've become a saint? Since when do you care about street children?" "You always said you didn't want children." "I said I didn't want children with you." The words came out before Edward could stop them, cutting through the air like a sharp blade. Isabella turned livid. "How dare you talk to me like that? I've been your girlfriend for 3 years. We've built a life together, and now you're going to throw it all away for some tramp you found on the street?" "Watch what you say about her," Edward warned, his voice acquiring a dangerous tone. "Sophia is an innocent child." "Innocent?" Isabella laughed bitterly. "Edward, you are extremely naive. This girl was probably trained by adults to evoke exactly that kind of compassion. It's an old scam, and you fell for it like a sucker." Edward felt his blood boil. "You don't know Sophia. You don't know what she's been through." "And you do," Isabella retorted. "In less than 24 hours, you've become an expert on her life." "Edward, listen to yourself. You're talking like a madman." From the room, they heard the soft sound of the television and Sophia's low laugh, watching some cartoon. The innocent sound contrasted brutally with the bitter argument happening in the living room. "Isabella," Edward said, trying to control his voice, "I know it sounds crazy, but something changed in me last night. When I saw that child being mistreated—" "Oh, of course," Isabella interrupted sarcastically. "The great businessman Edward Davis had a humanitarian epiphany. What a beautiful story. But what about our life? What about our plans? What about the engagement party we were organizing?" Edward stopped breathing for a moment. "Engagement party? Yes, is your memory failing too? We discussed this before my trip. I was going to come back with the ring I ordered in Paris, and we were going to announce our engagement at next week's charity dinner." The revelation hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. In recent months, Isabella had vaguely talked about next steps in their relationship, but he had never formally agreed to an engagement. She had unilaterally decided and expected him to simply agree. "So," Isabella pressed, crossing her arms, "what's it going to be, Edward? Your real life with me, or this ridiculous fantasy with a child you don't even know?" Edward looked at Isabella, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time in 3 years. There she was, a beautiful woman, impeccably dressed, who represented everything society considered desirable in a partner. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw only coldness, calculation, and a cruelty that had always been there, disguised under a veneer of sophistication. "Do you want me to choose?" Edward asked slowly, his voice strangely calm. "Obviously," Isabella retorted, tossing her hair back impatiently. "I'm not going to compete with a street child for my boyfriend's attention. That's absolutely ridiculous." From the room, Sophia's laughter reached them again, pure and crystal clear like spring water. Edward closed his eyes and, at that moment, understood something fundamental about himself. For years, he had built a life based on appearances, status, and social approval. He had been with Isabella because she perfectly complemented his image as a successful man. But Sophia had awakened something in his heart that he didn't even know existed. A capacity for unconditional love, to protect the vulnerable, to be genuinely human. "All right," Edward said, opening his eyes and looking directly at Isabella. "I choose." Isabella smiled victoriously. Already heading toward the phones. "Great. I'll call social services immediately. They'll take that child back to where she belongs, and we can forget this whole craziness ever happened." "No," Edward said with a firmness that made her stop in her tracks. "I choose Sophia." The silence that followed was absolute. Isabella slowly turned, her face registering a mixture of shock and disbelief that quickly turned into pure fury. "You're joking with me," she whispered dangerously. "I've never been more serious in my life," Edward replied. "Sophia stays. You decide if you want to stay too and get to know us better, or if you prefer to leave." "Leave!" Isabella screamed, completely losing her elegant composure. "Are you kicking me out of our home because of some tramp?" "Watch out," Edward warned, his voice acquiring an icy tone. "That's the second time you've spoken about Sophia like that. There won't be a third." Isabella stared at him as if he were a complete stranger. "Edward, you've completely lost your mind. Did that child brainwash you? In less than 24 hours, you've become a different person." "Perhaps," Edward admitted, "or perhaps I've finally become who I was meant to be all along." From the room, they heard small footsteps approaching. Sophia appeared at the door, holding Theodore, her large, worried eyes alternating between Edward and Isabella. "Dad," she said timidly, "are you fighting because of me?" Edward knelt and opened his arms to her. Sophia ran to him, and he hugged her protectively. "Don't worry, sweetie. Everything's all right. I can leave if I'm causing trouble," Sophia offered with a maturity devastating for a 6-year-old. "I know how to manage on the streets." "You're not going anywhere," Edward said firmly. Looking directly at Isabella, "This is your home now." Isabella observed the scene with an expression of thinly disguised disgust. "I can't believe what I'm seeing. You're really going to throw our life away for this... For my daughter," Edward completed, the word sounding natural for the first time. "Your daughter?" Isabella laughed bitterly. "Edward, you don't even know her real name. You don't know where she came from, who her parents are, what life she's had, and you're willing to sacrifice 3 years of a relationship for a complete stranger." "Sophia isn't a stranger," Edward retorted, feeling the girl snuggle closer in his arms. "She's the most honest and genuine person I've ever met. In 24 hours, she taught me more about love and gratitude than you have in 3 years." Isabella turned livid. "Fine," she said, with a venomous voice. "Since you've made your choice, I'll make mine too. But know that I won't let this go. I'll make sure everyone in our social circle knows exactly what kind of man you've become." "Feel free," Edward replied calmly. "I no longer care what those people think." Isabella headed for the luggage she had left at the entrance. "You'll regret this, Edward. When reality hits and you realize you've been manipulated by a street child, you'll beg me to come back. But it will be too late. There will be no regret," Edward assured her. Isabella paused at the door, turning one last time. "Oh, and Edward, I hope you're prepared for the consequences, because I'll make sure this situation reaches the right ears. Social services, the press, everyone will know about your little fantasy." With these threatening words, Isabella slammed the door shut. The apartment fell silent, except for the sound of Sophia and Edward's breathing. "Dad," Sophia whispered. "Is she going to take me away?" Edward looked at the girl in his arms and realized he had just declared war on the society he knew. But he also understood that, for the first time in his life, he was fighting for something that truly mattered. "No one is taking you away," he promised, knowing he had just made his life infinitely more complicated, but also infinitely more meaningful. A week passed since Isabella's dramatic exit, and Edward began to realize that his ex-girlfriend had not made empty threats. The first signs appeared subtly: strange glances from the doorman, unreturned messages from business colleagues, social invitations that simply stopped coming. Sophia had adapted to the routine with an ease that surprised Edward. She woke up early, helped set the breakfast table, and spent mornings exploring the children's books he had bought for her. In the afternoons, they watched movies together on the couch, Sophia always holding Theodore and asking questions about everything she saw. "Dad," she said that Monday morning, "why aren't you going to work today?" Edward hesitated. In recent days, he had avoided the office, working from home whenever possible. The truth was, he wasn't prepared to face the questions and judgments that surely awaited him in the corporate environment. "I'm working from home to spend more time with you," he replied, which was partially true. Sophia smiled, but her eyes showed a perception beyond her age. "People are talking about us, aren't they?" Sophia's direct question surprised him. "Why do you think that?" "Yesterday, when we went to the grocery store, I heard a lady whisper to another about that rich man who adopted a street child," Sophia explained calmly. "And the doorman always looks at me strangely." Edward felt his heart tighten. He had tried to shield Sophia from the malicious speculation and comments, but the girl was more observant than he had imagined. "What people say doesn't matter, sweetie. What matters is that we're family." "I know," Sophia said, climbing onto the sofa beside him. "I just don't want you to have problems because of me." Before Edward could answer, the doorbell rang. He checked the intercom and saw two women in dark suits waiting in the lobby. One of them showed an ID badge to the camera. "Social Services," she announced. "We need to speak with Mr. Edward Davis regarding a complaint we received." Edward felt his blood run cold. Isabella's threats were coming true. He looked at Sophia, who had paled upon hearing the words "social services." "Dad," she whispered, clutching Theodore tightly. "Are they going to take me away?" "They're not taking you," Edward promised, but his voice trembled slightly. "Stay in your room while I talk to them." Sophia obeyed reluctantly, but Edward could see the fear in her eyes. When the social workers came up, he tried to maintain his composure, but he knew he was about to face the first official attack against his decision. "Mr. Davis," said the older social worker, a woman with greying hair and a severe expression. "And I'm Dr. Marina Hayes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Ann Miller. We received a serious complaint about a child in an irregular situation living in this apartment." "There's nothing irregular," Edward defended himself. "Sophia is my adopted daughter." "Mr. Davis," Dr. Miller interjected, consulting a folder full of papers, "there is no adoption process registered in your name. Furthermore, we received information that this child was found on the streets just a week ago." Edward realized he was treading on dangerous ground. "I'm in the process of getting all the necessary documentation. It's a process that takes time." "We understand," said Dr. Hayes, "but in the meantime, we need to verify the conditions in which the child is living and assess if this environment is suitable for her." "Of course it's suitable," Edward retorted, feeling the defensiveness grow in his voice. "Sophia has everything she needs: food, clothes, medical care." "Mr. Davis," Dr. Miller interrupted him gently, "we also received information about your emotional stability. It is alleged that your decision to adopt this child was impulsive and that you may be going through some kind of personal crisis." Edward immediately understood the source of this information. Isabella had planted seeds of doubt about his mental state, creating an argument to question his capacity to care for Sophia. "May I speak with the child?" asked Dr. Hayes. "Sophia!" Edward called. "Can you come here, please?" Sophia appeared slowly, holding Theodore against her chest. Her clothes were clean and well kept, her hair combed, but it was impossible to hide the fear in her eyes. "Hi, Sophia," said Dr. Hayes in a soft voice. "I'm Marina. Can I ask you a few questions?" Sophia nodded timidly, looking at Edward for encouragement. "Are you happy here?" the social worker asked. "Very happy," Sophia replied sincerely. "Dad takes very good care of me." "And before you came to live here, where did you live?" Sophia hesitated, looking at Edward again. "On the streets, alone." Dr. Miller made notes in her folder. "How long have you known Mr. Davis?" "1 week," Sophia admitted, "but he saved me. I was very hungry and he gave me food, and he said I was his daughter when the bad man wanted to hurt me." Edward saw the social workers exchange significant glances. Sophia's honesty, though touching, was inadvertently providing evidence that he had acted impulsively. "Sophia," Dr. Hayes continued, "do you know that sometimes adults need time to sort out important paperwork before children can stay with them?" Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "Are you going to take me away from him? We're just making sure everything is in order," Dr. Miller explained diplomatically. Edward saw the fear grow on Sophia's face and knew he was losing the battle. The social workers were competent professionals doing their job, but the circumstances, the absence of legal documentation, the impulsive nature of his decision, the complaints about his stability, were building a case against him. "Mr. Davis," said Dr. Hayes, closing her folder, "we'll need a few days to evaluate the situation. During this period, we recommend that Sophia stay temporarily in a shelter home while we regularize all the documentation." "No!" Sophia cried, running into Edward's arms. "Please don't take me away. I promise to be a good girl." Edward hugged Sophia tightly, feeling tears burn his eyes. The bureaucratic machine Isabella had set in motion was working exactly as she had planned. 3 days passed since the social workers' visit, 3 days of increasing tension and constant fear. Edward had hired the best family lawyer in the city, but Mr. Robert Anderson had been clear, without official documentation and with the complaints about his mental stability, the process would be long and complicated. Sophia seemed to understand the gravity of the situation better than a 6-year-old should. She had become even more affectionate, helping with everything she could, as if trying to prove her worth and ensure she wouldn't be abandoned again. "Dad," she said on Thursday morning while they were having breakfast, "if they take me, will you look for me?" Edward stopped eating, looking at those big eyes full of a vulnerability that broke his heart. "Sophia, no one is taking you. I'm doing everything I can to resolve this situation. But if they do take me," she insisted with childish persistence, "do you promise you'll look for me? Promise you won't forget me?" "I would never forget you," Edward promised, his voice choked. "You're my daughter, and families don't abandon each other." Sophia smiled, but there was sadness in her smile. "Okay, just wanted to make sure." The doorbell rang, and Edward felt his stomach clench. When he checked the intercom, he saw Dr. Hayes and Dr. Miller accompanied by 2 more people, a uniformed man and a younger woman carrying a folder. "Mr. Davis," said Dr. Hayes when they came up, "we are very sorry, but we have received a temporary court order. Sophia needs to be transferred to a shelter home until all documentation is regularized." Edward felt the world collapse around him. "How long?" "It depends on how the process goes," explained Mr. Anderson, who had arrived with the social workers. It could be weeks, maybe months. "No," Edward said firmly. "I won't allow this." "Mr. Davis," the court officer interjected, "the order is legal. We have no choice." Sophia had heard the conversation from the hallway and appeared slowly, holding Theodore. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she was trying to be brave. "Dad, are they going to take me now?" Edward knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. "It's just temporary, sweetie. Dad will fix everything and come get you soon." "I know," Sophia whispered, though her tears told a different story. "Can you keep Theodore to take care of you while I'm not here?" "No," Edward said, gently pushing the teddy bear back to her. "Theodore goes with you. You'll need him more than I will." The younger social worker approached gently. "Sophia, I'll help you pack some clothes, okay?" Sophia nodded and followed the woman to the room. Edward heard their muffled voices as she packed her few belongings. When they returned, Sophia was carrying a small backpack Edward had bought for her. "It's all ready," said the social worker. Sophia ran to Edward and hugged him with all the strength her small arms allowed. "I love you, Dad," she whispered in his ear. "Thank you for giving me the best week of my life." Edward felt the tears stream freely down his face. "I love you too, daughter. And this isn't goodbye, it's just see you later. Promise, I promise." Sophia slowly pulled away, wiping her own tears. "I'll be a good girl at the shelter. I'll brush my teeth and eat all my food, just like you taught me." "I know you will," Edward said, his voice breaking. Dr. Hayes gently took Sophia's hand. "Come on, sweetie. The shelter has other children your age. You'll make new friends." Sophia looked back one last time before leaving. "Bye." "Dad, don't forget me." "Never," Edward promised. When the door closed, the apartment fell into a deafening silence. Edward remained standing in the same spot for several minutes, looking at the door as if Sophia could return at any moment. Mr. Anderson placed a hand on his shoulder. "Edward, I know this is difficult, but we'll work tirelessly to bring her back." "How long will it really take?" Edward asked, his voice sounding distant. "Weeks, at minimum. Maybe months. It depends on whether we can prove your mental stability and your capacity to care for her. And we also need to find out who made the complaints and what their motivation was." Edward knew exactly who had made the complaints, but proving it would be another matter. Isabella had been clever, using official channels and planting doubts about his sanity without leaving direct traces. That night, Edward dined alone for the first time in a week. The apartment seemed empty and lifeless. He had grown accustomed to Sophia's sounds, her laughter, her constant questions, the patter of her small feet running through the halls. When he went to bed, he passed by the room that had been Sophia's. The bed was made, but it still carried her faint scent. On the nightstand she had left a drawing, 2 stick figures representing her and Edward, with a red heart between them and the words, "I love you, Daddy," written in crooked letters. Edward sat on the bed and cried as he hadn't cried in years. For the first time in his life, he had experienced the unconditional love of a daughter. And now that love had been torn from his arms by bureaucracy and the revenge of a spiteful woman. But as he held Sophia's drawing, Edward made a silent promise. He would move heaven and earth to bring her back. No matter how long it took, how much money it cost, or how many legal battles he had to face, Sophia was his daughter, and he wouldn't rest until she was back home. 2 weeks had passed since Sophia was taken. 2 weeks that felt like an eternity to Edward. Mr. Anderson had managed to secure authorization for supervised visits once a week, but each encounter left Edward more devastated than the last. Sophia was at St. Jude's Children's Home, an institution on the outskirts of the city that while licensed, clearly operated with limited resources. During his visits, Edward noticed how Sophia had changed. Her eyes had lost some of their sparkle. She spoke less, smiled less, and seemed to be resigning herself again to the idea of abandonment. "Dad, she said during Wednesday's visit. "You still trying to get me back?" "Of course I am," Edward assured her, holding her small hands. "And Day, why do you ask that?" "Aunt Martha said that sometimes adults give up when things get too hard," Sophia explained with a heartbreaking sadness, "and that it's better for me not to get my hopes up too much." Edward felt a deep anger swell in his chest. "Sophia, look at me. I'm never going to give up on you. Never. Understand?" Sophia nodded, but Edward could see that the seed of doubt had been planted. Time and separation were doing their cruel work, undermining the trust they had built together. It was that afternoon, as he returned from the shelter, that Edward decided to take more drastic measures. Mr. Anderson was doing everything within the law, but the legal process was being deliberately slowed down by bureaucratic obstacles that seemed to arise at every turn. Edward hired a private investigator, Marcus Green, a former police officer with a reputation for uncovering inconvenient truths. If Isabella was behind the sabotage, he needed concrete proof. "Mr. Davis," Marcus said 3 days later, sitting in Edward's office with a folder full of documents, "I found some interesting things about your ex-girlfriend." "What did you find?" Marcus opened the folder and spread photographs and documents on the table. "Isabella Montgomery not only made the initial complaints, but she's also actively sabotaging your efforts to get Sophia back." Edward leaned forward. "How? She has an influential friend at the district attorney's office, Dr. Charles Thompson. They met in Paris during her trip. She convinced him that you're having a psychotic breakdown and that you pose a danger to the child." Edward felt his blood boil. "She's fabricating evidence?" "Worse than that," Marcus continued, showing a series of printed emails. "She's paying false witnesses to testify about your erratic behavior. And there's more. She also bribed shelter staff to report that Sophia is better off without you and that she's already adapting well." This is monstrous," Edward whispered. "There's more." Marcus turned a page. "I found out she intends to prolong the process until Sophia turns 2 years old at the shelter. After that period, the legal bond between you would be considered definitively severed by law, making a future adoption almost impossible." Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. Isabella wasn't just trying to separate them temporarily. She was orchestrating a systematic destruction of any chance for him to get Sophia back. "Why would she do that?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Pure revenge," Marcus replied. "In the emails I intercepted, she makes it clear that she considers your choice of Sophia a personal humiliation that needs to be punished." Edward looked at a photo of Isabella at an expensive restaurant with Dr. Charles Thompson, both smiling as they toasted. While he suffered from the separation from Sophia, Isabella was celebrating her victory. "There's something else," Marcus hesitated. "I visited the shelter disguised as a volunteer inspector. The conditions are worse than you imagine. Sophia is in a room with 8 other children. There are cases of bullying that the staff ignore and—" Marcus stopped, clearly reluctant to continue. "Tell me," Edward ordered. "Sophia is sick. She developed mild pneumonia that isn't being properly treated. Medical resources are limited, and she's wasting away, Mr. Davis, physically and emotionally." Edward stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "Pneumonia? Why wasn't I informed?" "Because Isabella also managed to have your visitation rights reduced to once a month. You wouldn't know unless you investigated." Edward felt the world spin around him while he battled through legal channels. Sophia was suffering, sick and believing he had given up on her. The woman who had shared his bed for 3 years was deliberately torturing an innocent child to get revenge on him. "Marcus," Edward said, his voice controlled but dangerous. "Oh, I need to see Sophia immediately. and I want all the evidence against Isabella organized for Mr. Robert Anderson first thing tomorrow morning. Sir, I must warn you that an unauthorized visit to the shelter could further jeopardize your case." Edward looked out his office window, seeing the city spread before him. He had built an empire by respecting rules, following protocols, playing society's game. But that very system was being used to destroy the child he loved. "Marcus," he finally said, "sometimes there are things more important than following rules. I need to see my daughter." That night, Edward began to plan something that would change everything. If the legal system was being manipulated against him, perhaps it was time to stop playing by others' rules and start fighting on his own terms. But first, he needed to see Sophia and find out exactly how much Isabella had managed to destroy of the girl he had known. The brave child who had offered her only possession to thank him for a meal, who had called a stranger Dad and changed his life forever. What Edward found at the shelter would force him to make the most radical decision of his life. Edward arrived at St. Jude's Children's Home on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after his conversation with Marcus. He had planned a surprise visit using his business contacts. One of his suppliers had catering contracts with the institution, creating a plausible excuse to show up unannounced. The grey, 3-story building looked even more depressing under the fine rain. The peeling walls and barred windows gave the structure the air of a prison rather than a home for children. Edward felt his stomach clench, imagining Sophia living in that desolate environment. "Mr. Davis," said the director, Mrs. Helen Cross, clearly nervous about his unexpected presence, "we weren't expecting your visit today. Sophia isn't up for visitors." "What do you mean she's not up for visitors?" Edward asked, trying to keep his voice controlled. "She's developed a respiratory condition and is a bit withdrawn," the director explained evasively. "Perhaps it would be better to reschedule for next week." "No," Edward said firmly. "I want to see her now." The director hesitated, exchanging glances with an assistant. Edward realized there was something they didn't want him to see. His determination only strengthened. "She's in the dormitory," the director finally said, "but please understand, she's not as you knew her." Edward followed the woman down dimly lit corridors, smelling of cheap disinfectant and dampness. The muffled sound of children playing in the inner courtyard reached them. But there was a sadness in the air that was almost palpable. When they reached the second-floor dormitory, Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. The room was long, with 8 iron bunk beds, thin mattresses, and a few small windows. Clothes hung on makeshift lines created precarious dividers between the beds. Sophia was in the last bed in the corner, huddled under a thin, worn blanket. When Edward approached, she slowly lifted her head. And he barely recognized her. The girl had lost a drastic amount of weight. Her cheeks, once chubby from the good food he had provided, were now sunken. Her large eyes seemed even bigger on her thin face, and there were dark circles under them. Her hair was disheveled and dull, but it was the expression in her eyes that broke Edward's heart. Where there had once been hope and joy, now there was only resignation. The special spark that made her unique had been extinguished. "Sophia," Edward whispered, kneeling beside the bed. She looked at him for a moment, as if she couldn't believe he was really there. "Dad?" Her voice came out hoarse and weak. "Yes, sweetie, it's me." Sophia tried to sit up, but a violent cough overcame her. Edward saw that her breathing was difficult and shallow. The pneumonia was more serious than Marcus had reported. You came to get me?" she asked when the cough subsided. Her voice laden with a cautious hope that broke Edward's heart. "I'm trying, Sophia. Every day I'm trying," he replied, taking her small, cold hand in his. "You're sick. Why didn't anyone tell me?" Sophia looked away. "Aunt Helen said, You didn't want to know about me anymore, that you'd given up because it was too complicated. Edward felt a murderous rage grow in his chest. Sophia, look at me, he said gently but firmly. I never gave up on you. Never. They're lying to you. But you stopped coming to see me, she said, tears beginning to roll down her thin cheeks. And Aunt Martha said real dads don't leave their daughters alone for so long. Edward understood the systematic cruelty of what was happening. Not only had they physically separated him and Sophia, but they were deliberately destroying the trust and love between them through lies and psychological manipulation. Sophia, Edward said, his voice trembling with emotion, do you still have Theodore? Sophia nodded weakly and pulled the teddy bear from under her pillow. The toy was even more worn, and Edward noticed more pieces of fur missing. Sophia hugged it against her chest as if it were her only connection to happiness. I tell him stories about our week together, she whispered, so he won't forget how good it was. Edward felt tears burn his eyes. Sophia, listen closely to what I'm going to tell you. I haven't given up on you. I never will. Some bad people are trying to separate us, but I'm going to find a way to get you back. Promise, she asked, but Edward could hear the doubt in her voice. Hope had been crushed so many times that she barely dared to believe. I promise, Edward said solemnly, and this time, no one will ever be able to separate us again. Sophia closed her eyes and rested her head on his shoulder. And I dream about our home every night, she murmured, with the big kitchen and the big TV and you making pancakes in the morning. Edward hugged Sophia delicately, feeling how fragile she was in his arms. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. The legal system had failed them. Society's rules were being used as weapons against an innocent child. When he left the shelter an hour later, Edward was no longer the same man. The sight of Sophia wasting away in that place, believing she had been abandoned, had broken something inside him and simultaneously forged an iron determination. That night, he called Mr. Robert Anderson with a proposal that shocked the lawyer. Edward was willing to give up his entire fortune, publicly expose Isabella's corruption, and sacrifice his social standing if necessary. The war had truly begun, and this time Edward would fight with every weapon available. Edward didn't sleep that night. Sitting in his office until dawn, he drafted a plan that could destroy his social and financial life, but which might be the only way to save Sophia. The evidence collected by Marcus was spread across his desk like pieces of a macabre puzzle that revealed the extent of Isabella's revenge. At 7 in the morning, he called the city's most respected investigative journalist, Raphael Sterling. Known for his exposés on corruption and social injustices, an hour later, Raphael was sitting in Edward's living room, listening to a story that visibly shocked him. Mr. Davis, Raphael said after reviewing all the documents, if we publish this, there's no turning back. Your private life will be exposed. Your ex-girlfriend can sue you for defamation, and you will become the center of a national controversy. I understand the risks, Edward replied calmly. But an innocent child is suffering as we speak. Sophia is sick, believing she's been abandoned, while those responsible for protecting her are being bought off to keep her away from me. Raphael made a few more notes. I'd need at least a week to verify all this information. Sophia doesn't have a week, Edward interrupted. Every day she spends in that shelter, she gets sicker and more convinced that there's no hope. I need your help now. That afternoon, Edward made the most radical decision of his life. He called a press conference in his office, something he had never done in his entire business career. Journalists from all major news outlets attended, curious about what the discreet millionaire would announce. Ladies and gentlemen, Edward began, his voice firm despite his nervousness. I've called this press conference to expose an injustice being committed against a 6-year-old child named Sophia. He told the entire story, from their meeting at the restaurant to the current situation. He showed Marcus's evidence of Isabella's sabotage, the bribes, the lies told to Sophia. He spared no details about his own initial lie, taking full responsibility for his impulsive actions. I acknowledge that my decision that night was impulsive, Edward admitted. But what happened afterward? A child being used as a pawn for revenge, a system being corrupted to separate a family, that is unacceptable. The journalists' questions were direct and sometimes hostile. Some questioned his mental stability, others suggested he was being manipulated, but Edward answered them all with brutal honesty about his feelings, his mistakes, and his determination to protect Sophia. Why are you risking your reputation for a child you met only a few weeks ago? A reporter asked. Edward thought for a moment before answering. Because sometimes you discover who you truly are only when everything you consider important is at risk. I discovered I would be capable of sacrificing my fortune, my social standing, everything, to protect this child. That tells me she isn't just a stranger. She is my daughter in every sense that truly matters. The press conference lasted 2 hours. When it ended, Edward knew he had signed his own sentence of social ostracism. His words would be analyzed, distorted, judged, but he also knew he had done the only right thing. That same night, the story exploded across all social media and news programs. Justice for Sophia became a trending topic. Videos of the press conference were shared millions of times. Public opinion dramatically divided between those who saw Edward as a hero and those who considered him an unstable man obsessed with a child. But something unexpected happened. Hundreds of people began to speak out in support of Edward and Sophia, parents who had faced similar issues with the adoption system, honest social workers outraged by the exposed corruption, ordinary citizens touched by the story of a child abandoned by the system that should protect her. On the second day after the press conference, a crowd gathered in front of St. Jude's Children's Home, demanding that Sophia receive proper medical treatment and that Edward's visits be reinstated. The public pressure was so intense that the district attorney's office was forced to open an investigation into the complaints against Isabella and her accomplices. Mr. Robert Anderson called Edward on the morning of the third day with news that made him cry with relief. Edward, we secured an emergency court order. Sophia will be transferred to a private hospital today to treat her pneumonia, and your daily visits are authorized during her treatment. Edward raced to the hospital faster than he ever had in his life. When he entered the private room where Sophia was hospitalized, she was awake, connected to machines monitoring her breathing, but her eyes had a sparkle he hadn't seen in weeks. "Dad!" she exclaimed upon seeing him, trying to sit up in bed. "The nurses said you fought the whole world to get me." Edward approached the bed and held her small hand. "I did fight, and I'll keep fighting until I bring you home." "Forever this time?" Sophia asked, her voice filled with cautious hope. Edward looked into his daughter's eyes and made a promise he knew he could keep, no matter the price. "Forever, my love, forever." Outside, the chants of hundreds of people who had gathered at the hospital demanding justice for Sophia could be heard. The lie Edward had told that night at the restaurant was becoming the most powerful truth of his life. A week after the life-changing press conference, Edward found himself in the office of the judge overseeing Sophia's case. Public pressure had been so immense that the district attorney's office had been compelled to expedite all investigations. The results had been devastating for Isabella and her accomplices. Dr. Charles Thompson had been suspended from his duties after the discovery of emails proving his participation in the scheme to delay Edward's process. 3 shelter employees were fired for accepting bribes to mistreat Sophia and lie about her well-being. And Isabella had simply disappeared, fleeing abroad before formal charges could be filed. "Mr. Davis," said Judge Arthur Jenkins, a grey-haired man with a kind expression, "after reviewing all the evidence and the psychological report confirming your full mental stability, as well as the medical opinion on Sophia's remarkable recovery since she has been under your care at the hospital, my decision is clear." Edward held his breath. Sophia was by his side, wearing a light blue dress he had bought, her hair already regaining its shine after a week of proper nutrition and medical care. She held Theodore with one hand and Edward's hand with the other. "The adoption is granted, effective immediately," the judge announced. Miss Sophia officially becomes Sophia Davis, legitimate daughter of Edward Davis, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. Sophia looked at Edward with wide eyes. "Does that mean I'm your real daughter now? Forever?" "Forever," Edward confirmed, tears of happiness streaming down his face. "You are my daughter, and I am your father. No one will ever be able to separate us again." Sophia let out a cry of joy and threw herself into Edward's arms. "Dad! My real dad!" Mr. Robert Anderson, who had accompanied the entire process, smiled broadly. "Edward, I've never seen a case resolved so quickly. The public mobilization was extraordinary." It was true. In recent days, Edward had received thousands of messages of support from people all over the world. The story of a man who had sacrificed his social standing to save an abandoned child had touched hearts on every continent. Donations poured in daily for children's charities in Sophia's name. "Dad," Sophia said as they left the courthouse, "can we go home now and make pancakes?" Edward laughed, a sound he hadn't made in weeks. "We can make pancakes every day if you want." "Not every day," Sophia replied seriously. "Otherwise, it won't be special anymore." The simple wisdom of the girl still constantly surprised Edward. During her stay at the hospital, she had matured even more, showing an impressive capacity to forgive and move forward. When he had asked if she held anger towards the people who hurt her, Sophia replied, "Mom always said holding on to anger is like holding a hot coal. It only burns the one holding it." It was the first time Sophia had mentioned her biological mother since they met. Edward knew there were still many stories to discover about his daughter's past, but now they had all the time in the world for it. On the way back home, they stopped at the same restaurant where everything had begun. The manager, Mr. Thomas, greeted them with warm smiles. "Mr. Davis, Sophia," he welcomed them. "It's an honor to have you back. Your table is reserved." During dinner, Sophia looked around the elegant restaurant with a completely different perspective. "Dad," she said, "remember when I asked for food here the first time?" "I remember every second," Edward replied. "I was so scared," Sophia continued, "but when you said I was your daughter, even though it was a lie, I felt like maybe the world wasn't such a scary place after all." "It wasn't a lie," Edward corrected gently. "My heart already knew the truth before my head understood. You were always my daughter, Sophia. We just needed the rest of the world to recognize it too." Sophia smiled and turned her attention to the plate of pasta she had ordered, the same as the first night. But this time, she ate slowly, savoring each bite, knowing there were many more meals to come. "Dad," she said suddenly, "what happened to the pretty lady who lived in our house?" Edward hesitated. How to explain Isabella to a child? She decided she didn't want to be part of our family. Sophia thought for a moment. She lost a lot, didn't she? Our family is very good. Edward smiled, impressed once more by his daughter's wisdom. Yes, she lost a lot. When they arrived home that night, Sophia ran directly to her room, now officially her room, forever. Edward watched her carefully arrange her few belongings, placing Theodore in a place of honor on the bed. "Dad," she called from the room. "Can you come here?" Edward found her sitting on the bed, holding something in her hands. It was the drawing she had made weeks ago, the two stick figures with a red heart between them. "When I was at the shelter, I thought this drawing had become a lie," she said. "But it didn't, did it?" "It never became a lie," Edward assured her, sitting beside her on the bed. "And it never will." Sophia snuggled against him. "Dad, thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for teaching me what it means to be a father," Edward replied, kissing the top of her head. That night, for the first time since they met, both slept in complete peace, knowing that nothing and no one could ever separate them again. The lie born of compassion had become the most beautiful truth of their lives. 6 months after that transformative night at the restaurant, Edward woke up to the aroma of pancakes coming from the kitchen. It was 7 in the morning on a sunny Saturday, and Sophia had insisted on preparing breakfast herself as a Saturday surprise, a tradition they had created together. When he went down to the kitchen, he found his daughter standing on a stool, concentrating on flipping a pancake in the air. Her hair was pulled back in 2 braids she had learned to do herself, and she wore the child's apron Edward had bought especially for her, with Chef Sophia embroidered on the front. "Good morning, Dad," she said cheerfully upon seeing him. "I'm making banana pancakes, your favorite." Edward smiled, observing how Sophia had grown in confidence and skills. The shy, frightened girl he had met had transformed into a vibrant, curious, and full-of-life child. She attended a private school where she quickly excelled due to her intelligence and natural kindness. "Need help?" Edward offered. "No, thank you. I can do it myself now," Sophia replied proudly. "But you can make the orange juice. I still can't reach the juicer." As they prepared breakfast together, Edward reflected on how his life had completely changed. Financially, he had lost some contracts due to the initial controversy. But his courageous decision to expose the corruption had also attracted new partners who admired his integrity. Socially, he had lost some superficial acquaintances, but gained true friendships with people who valued substance over appearance. "Dad," Sophia said as they served the pancakes, "today is a special day, you know." "Why?" Edward asked, sitting at the table that now had 2 permanent settings, 2 chairs that belonged to a real family. "Because it's exactly 6 months since you found me," Sophia explained. "Half a year that we've been a family." Edward had forgotten the exact date, but Sophia had kept it in her memory as a sacred milestone. "You're right. It's our family anniversary." "And I have a surprise for you," Sophia said, running to her room and returning with a small, poorly wrapped package, clearly prepared by childish hands. Edward carefully opened the present and found a simple wooden frame that Sophia had decorated with colorful stickers and glitter. Inside was a photo of the 2 of them taken the previous week at the park, both smiling broadly as Sophia hung from Edward's shoulders. "It's for your office," Sophia explained, "for when you miss me at work." Edward felt his eyes fill with tears. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received." "Read what's written on the back," Sophia asked, barely containing her excitement. Edward turned the frame and read the message written in Sophia's still uncertain handwriting. "To the best daddy in the world. Thank you for lying that day and making the lie true. I love you forever." Sophia. Sophia, Edward whispered, completely overwhelmed. Theodore helped me write it, she confessed. Pointing to the teddy bear sitting in its own little chair at the table, he said it was true, because you really are the best daddy in the world. After breakfast, they went to the park where Sophia had learned to ride her bike. Edward watched her confidently pedal along the paths, occasionally stopping to pick flowers or observe birds. Other families were enjoying the sunny Saturday, and several people warmly greeted Edward and Sophia. Their story had become a symbol of hope in the city. St. Jude's Children's Home had been renovated with donations that poured in after the exposure of its precarious conditions. 3 other children were adopted by families inspired by Edward and Sophia's story, and Isabella. She'd never tried to make contact again, apparently building a new life away from the consequences of her actions. "Dad," Sophia said when they stopped to rest on a shaded bench, "or do you regret anything?" The question surprised Edward. "Why do you ask that?" "At school, the teacher said sometimes adults regret decisions they make when they're angry or sad," Sophia explained. "Were you sad that day at the restaurant?" Edward thought carefully before answering. "I was very lonely," he admitted, "but I don't regret anything that happened afterward." "You are the best thing that has ever happened in my life. Even losing money and friends," Sophia insisted. "Sophia," Edward said, taking her small hands in his, "I learned that there are 2 kinds of wealth in the world. One you can lose if you're not careful. The other grows the more you share. You taught me which one truly matters." Sophia smiled and snuggled against him on the bench. "I also learned something important." "What?" "That sometimes angels disguise themselves as ordinary people," she said. "And sometimes you have to be very sad or very hungry to recognize an angel when he appears." Edward kissed the top of Sophia's head, feeling a deep gratitude for every event that had led them to that perfect moment. When they returned home late in the afternoon, they stopped once more in front of Le Bernardin. The restaurant continued to be one of the city's most elegant, but now it was also known as the place where the city's most beautiful love story began. As a newspaper article had written, "Dad," Sophia said, looking at the entrance where everything had started, "do you think other kids like me need dads like you?" Edward looked at his daughter, impressed once more by her ability to think of others, even after everything she had been through. "Yeah, probably. Then maybe we could help find them," Sophia suggested. "Not to live with us, because our family is already perfect the way it is, but to help other dads and moms not be afraid to love." Edward smiled, realizing that Sophia had planted the seed of something that could become his next purpose. "Do you think we should start a foundation to help children find families?" "Yes!" Sophia exclaimed. "And then we could call it the Theodore Foundation." "Why Theodore?" "Because he took care of me when I was alone, just like you did," Sophia explained logically. "And now he can help other kids find their angels too." That night, as he put Sophia to sleep, Edward understood that his journey as a father was just beginning. He had learned that true love is not something you find. It's something you choose to create every day through small acts of courage and kindness. "Dad," Sophia whispered as he was leaving the room, "thank you for lying that day." "Thank you for turning my lie into the most beautiful truth of my life," Edward replied. Sophia smiled and closed her eyes, holding Theodore against her chest. Edward watched her for a moment, knowing that from now on, every lie told for love could become the most precious truth in the world. Sometimes, the most beautiful stories begin with the most improbable words, spoken by hearts that choose to see beyond appearances and recognize the humanity in every child forgotten by the world.